Hey guys, alright, today we are watching another What If History, or well, another alternate history of video. This time, what if Germany won World War II? Part 2. Um, I thought I had watched this video, but apparently I did not. I watched part 1 back in August of 2020. That was a long time ago. I've completely forgotten what he said in the first part, but we're gonna continue on with this series a little late. Um, hopefully, I think I fixed the issues I was having with my sound that were present in the last two videos, and I apologize for those. I don't know what happened. I honestly do not know what happened. Nothing should have been messed with in my settings. Nothing was changed in my settings from what they were before I added my second monitor, so I honestly have no clue why the sound decided to be all funky and not, I guess, catch my voice sometimes. Even though I still talk, I talked in the same volume I usually do. I don't know, something screwed up. I don't know what did. None of the numbers changed in my filters or my settings for my microphone. So, I don't think I changed anything that's up here. I don't remember touching anything that's, this microphone has some knobs on it, but I didn't touch them. Oh god, what is with my hair? Anyways, let's go ahead and dive right into What If Germany Won World War II, Part 2. Of course, a near impossible scenario, but hey, that's what we're here for. That's what alternate history is here for.
Europe has fallen
Holy
to Germany.
shit.
The Allies are nothing more than
It's
a
loud.
footnote in history, and former Slavic lands are now breadbaskets for the Aryan race. This is part 2 to my series, What If Germany Won World War II? If you haven't watched part 1, click here so you can catch up on the scenario. We left part 1 with Europe now not only under Nazi occupation, but subjected to fascist dominance as well. In our timeline across the Western world, a counterculture movement split generations apart. In this alternate timeline,
And we are still living with that counterculture movement. Like, yeah, I guess boomers are people that were teens and adults in their 60s and 70s, in the 60s and 70s, had that counterculture that separated them from like the World War II generation, World War I generation. And now there's that culture movement again, but with millennials and Gen Z against the boomers.
and the generations are
And then there's Gen X just sitting in the middle awkwardly, not knowing what to do with their lives. Sorry, Gen Xers.
still divided, however, with a cultural split between some of the older generation and their fanatical, indoctrinated children. The older generation still support the fascist states, but just not to the emotional extent that the newer, more impressionable generation does. Party education teaches not only who was the enemy, but to encourage and train children to use.
Oh, I should not be watching this with the current events that are going on with Israel. Oh boy.
Use outright violence against those deemed a threat to Germany. With each passing generation, children become more violent, fanatical, and devoted to an ever-secured ideology. Education becomes mandatory.
Yes. So one of the things that was very, I mean, with the Hitler Youth in Germany of World War II, it is crazy how like a lot. I'm one of these people. I'm one of these people that's like, oh, propaganda won't work. Propaganda will work to a certain extent, but it can't brainwash you. But then you go read stuff from World War II about the kids that legitimately believed in the Nazi government because that was all that they were taught. It fucking works, and it's goddamn terrifying.
By the state, but the type of education would be only to solidify the racial ideology of the party.
Yes.
Nothing.
That was something that I believe was also present already under Nazi Germany when it came to educating, at the very least, those that were part of the Hitler Youth programs. Because those people would also tell on their parents if they were like hiding a Jew or being anti-party things. I don't know if this was taught to just regular schooling in. I don't know if it was exclusive just to the Hitler Youth or beyond. I would assume that it was beyond the Hitler Youth. That kind of propaganda thought in education.
Nothing else. History, science, and the humanities are taught in the perspective of the Germans against all, or to shape the mindset of the Aryan destiny. Use of violence against undesirables and military service to the state is idealized and praised. For a man to be a true citizen of Germany, he would have to serve in the armed forces, and for a woman to be married and bear children. To many German children,
Very much like the scenario that's in Man in the High Castle, if you ever watched the show or read the books. Actually, I never read the book. I only watched the show. But what is present in the show and emphasized a lot is that role of the man and the woman of a German house.
they were born into a society which
Nazi
actively
house.
praises them for just being born. They would have never seen any atrocities or brutality, as those methods rid the fatherland of minorities long ago. Any mention of such methods would be praised as actions of heroes and made in legend, except for the true extent and methods of the Holocaust, which is a closely guarded secret. Throughout this series, I'm sure you
That is what, see, that's the one thing that I'm always like so debated on, is how well, like, we're told all the time that like Germans living in the villages nearby did not know about the camps, but it's like the fucking smoke. You can smell that. You can smell, if at the very least, if you're, I can understand maybe prison internment camps, maybe, but not the death camps. I cannot believe someone that says that they did not know that they had a death camp near them. Burning corpses smell. There is a noticeable smell. I don't know why I'm going on this tangent here, but I cannot believe any of the people that are like, no, if you can smell the smoke, you know that it's a horrible smell. It's a distinct smell.
You've been wondering, wouldn't people eventually revolt against the fascists? Wouldn't they see the oppressive policies and unite against the puppet states and even in Nazi Germany against Hitler himself? How would such a reality even become a reality? Simply from a military victory. The Nazi victory and fascist states they propped up all easily could have fell into disorder or at least civil war, even if Germany
100%.
won World War II. Nazism in our timeline was a quick experiment. It burnt hot, but quickly was snuffed out. We can never.
Which is something that's so. One of the things that's crazy about this is how quickly fascism was attempted and then how quickly it died off. Now, of course, you can make an argument that fascism is just kind of like the dictatorship of Stalin is very much like fascism, right? But just under a different, I guess, name. But of course, it's more complicated than that, and I don't want to try and even brush on it. I'm just gonna leave it at that. But like how quickly it came and fell is so new to human history. Things happening fast and then disappearing just as fast. Because we had kings for thousands of years, and we've had, I mean, arguably we have had democracy for over 1,000 years, maybe a couple thousand years. But really, I wouldn't say we have had modern democracy up until the last couple hundred years. Maybe before the American Revolution, with, you know, the Italian Republican states, you know, like Venice and stuff. Maybe you could argue those are a bit closer to, could be early signs of modern democracy. But also you can legitimately argue that really modern democracy didn't really start until late 1700s, post-Enlightenment. That's what I would say.
Never truly know how Nazis would hold on to their great empire if they achieved military victory. This scenario was simply the best case scenario for.
They would have to have such an overarching and just sheer numerical, like just their military would have to be massive in order to maintain control of their land.
The Nazis, considering they don't botch the odds against themselves. If things did not go perfectly for the Nazis, they would deal with full-out insurrection, rebellion, and civil war in occupied territories, and perhaps even fighting amongst Nazis inside the party in Germany itself, all which would certainly harm the stability of the Third Reich. If Nazism was to survive and keep its hold on Europe, it would need to deeply ingrain itself in the hearts and minds of the conquered. Military victories would certainly give credit to the government, but two other factors are just as important. economic stability,
Yep.
and the infallibility of the leader. In this
Yes, 100%. And the economic stability, I think, for pretty much a state that rules the world is gonna stay that way. But the infallibility of the leader. Once Hitler dies, the authority of the Nazi regime kind of dies. Like, arguably, upon Hitler's death, fascism also dies, or at least Nazi fascism. Maybe fascism, and obviously fascism to a certain extent will, of course, survive, but the Nazi fascism, it dies with Hitler. I don't see Goebbels and Himmler are perhaps the only two that could continue that lineage, but they are also, at least by this time, and especially by the time Hitler would die, would already be up in age as well. So then you're left with that scenario, where they will die eventually as well.
alternate scenario, if the Nazi economic model
Wow,
held
I
up,
am talking
created
a lot.
jobs, and allowed good standards of living in the first decade after the war, Europeans would not only accept the new status of German domination, but actively support the fascist governments
As
set
long
up in
as people
place.
are making
It would
money and
legitimize
survive,
fascism
they
as a
will be
new
fine
theory
with
to govern by, like monarchy,
things.
democracy, or socialism. Nazism is practically a cult, one that takes the word of the Führer, Adolf Hitler, as law. If Hitler or a new leader somehow lost credibility within the early years of the Reich, the system would be at risk of being weakened. As the decades move on, this becomes less of a risk as Nazism forms a solid bedrock foundation through myth and legend. The best comparison is with the founding fathers to the United States.
Yes.
Violence is used across fascist
Yes.
Europe against political opponents and critics, silencing any immediate threats by gunpoint or deportation.
To help, I guess, understand that point that he made about the founding fathers, the founding fathers, they knew that times would change and that things should change with it. However, as time has gone on, the American, at least right-leaning, more conservative-leaning people, and even a lot of left-leaning voices have said that, it's turned into reinterpretation of their words and not necessarily changing their words to fit the modern time. Which is, we're kind of making these people from a couple hundred years ago, probably smarter than they really were, because, we've had this system in place since 1776, kind of, but really not until, I think, 1780s, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, and then we tried Confederation, and then eventually we turned from a Confederation into a Union, or the modern day, way state, stronger federal government, less state power is what we transitioned into after our experiment with Confederation in the early days. But as time has gone on, we've kind of looked to them more as a bedrock and like, I guess, a beacon, even though they also were people that owned slaves. It's fucking weird. It's stupid. You shouldn't be looking to 300-year-old documents. You look to 300-year-old documents to understand that time period, and not to make laws for the modern day. Times change. Make some new papers.
This decreases the threat of rebellion as political critics are killed off with frightening efficiency.
And what I just said is probably going to piss off a good amount of people if they see this.
What would life be like for the average German inside the Third Reich? In our timeline, the Western world sees a capitalist and consumerist lifestyle. In North Korea, the state rules everything. In Australia, emus and dingoes wage brutal genocide against the populace. What
Goddamn emus. They'll get you next
could
time.
we expect in an alternate Nazi Germany society? It's difficult to assume how a short experiment like the Confederate States could have survived without the North. It would be just as difficult to assume the peacetime
manage the
economic
markets.
policies of the Third Reich, say a decade or two after the war. Like I said, Nazism was a movement which burned hot and went out fast. Its
Yep.
creation and sustainability in our timeline depended on having an enemy to fight. This isn't to say it would
100%.
collapse, but it certainly would have to adapt to a continent without enemies. Nazism didn't place economics as a crucial
Nazism really, for those that don't know, but I'm assuming that a lot of you, at least watching part 2, know this. But just in case, I'm gonna say it anyways. When Nazism was gaining traction in the 1920s in Germany, their main enemy and the reason that they were garnering a lot of support in in that decade and then into 1930s was because that they made communism their enemy. Now, of course, communism was also a bit on the rise, so that was the main that was their main competitor. But they were able to expertly make communism evil, or made themselves seem better than the communists, Communist Party of Germany, and yeah,
crucially important thing. Hitler
that's one
saw
of the reasons why they
economic
grew power.
policy as
It's obviously very complicated.
simply a way to fuel the eventual war effort and sustain it, a secondary factor to building the army and achieving Lebensraum. It's hard to predict how the Third Reich could handle its own economy after the war and after the Russians were destroyed. Nazism was a product of its time. Predicting its economy would be comparable to predicting how the United States would run its internal affairs today based off how the economy was conducted in 1920. We wouldn't see crucial factors which propped up and changed the course. So predicting how Hitler could have dealt with, say, an economic crash or an oil crisis would not be entirely accurate. I can't go into much detail about how the German economy would be after the war, but I can say a brief generalization. I believe that the Reich would organize its economy simply off of Lebensraum. Every part of the German society, the economy, government, and people itself was simply to wipe out the enemies of the Reich. Once Lebensraum was achieved, I believe in this alternate timeline, the Nazi Party would reorganize the economy away from the war effort and focus its economy on what best suits maintaining the land it conquered. Standard of living can fall.
Because one of the reasons that German remilitarization was so successful, and also how it helped boost the economy, at least for the German citizen. Obviously, as we know, I believe we watched a video from Armchair Historian maybe a few months back now, where he talked about how Germany revitalized the economy. Like, was it actually, like, how good really was the German economy? And what we learned there is that Germany used slaves or undesirables and stuff, and counted certain groups of people as being employed when in really they weren't making truly a living wage. So it was more deceptive than it was a lot more deceptive than what the numbers show. But what we can assume based off of our knowledge of 1930s German economy with its remilitarization is that it was very organized, and it was pretty effective at, still boosting German economy. I would say the average German, and especially since we're in a timeline where the Germans win World War II, and they're killing off and committing a mass genocide of a shit ton of people, that I would say that the average German probably is living a much better life than compared to what they had in 1930. Because now Germany is the center of the world. Now this is just me guessing. Guessing off of pretty basic knowledge, because my knowledge on the German state pretty much post 1930 is very lacking.
Production of goods can fall, starvation could occur, but the Nazis would never allow 1 inch of land to fall into the hands of the enemy. The Reich never trades with nations outside its realm of influence. This isn't much of a problem considering the Reich has influence over the British, French, and Italians for resources. Raw materials are harnessed through slave labor in the Russian colonies. The German people could see a society of great wealth and prosperity, or one of poverty and rations. No matter what in this alternate timeline, their fate would depend on the military expeditions of the Reich. Society would accept that above all else, territory is what truly matters, above individual fulfillment. In our timeline, one thing that stands out about Nazi Germany, 100%. Apart from the brutal conquest and genocidal nature, was the advances the Germans made in military technology. How would this have progressed if the Third Reich had not collapsed? Eugenics, social Darwinism, and genealogy were all popular across the Western world at the time, but used by
Yeah.
the calculating Nazis to legitimize their objectives for the Aryan race. These were not new ideas created by Hitler, but they were areas of academia that the Nazis harnessed for their own ideology. In our timeline, Nazism made eugenics and social Darwinism unpopular, but had they won the war, research and the ideas would have become far more popular across Europe and the globe. Inhuman experiments
The
on
Doctor
Untermensch
is
still
here.
continue
Oh, no.
in this alternate timeline, sponsored by the government.
Mangala.
Scientific advancement is determined by politics. In our timeline, half of Germans in university were studying medicine. Genetics and medical studies
Wow.
were preferred by the state to
That's a fucking lot. That's a lot.
maintain a healthy and efficient Aryan race. Women would be discouraged from pursuing education or careers that were not beneficial to producing children. Technology is only advanced that is positive to the state. Tech that is threatening to the Reich is discouraged to be continued. Communication like cell phones, the internet, and other forms of communication easy to spread ideas are killed in development, never made available to the masses. Generations of lawyers, scholars, scientists, and engineers grow up fed the propaganda of the state. If Nazi plans were successful, the intellectuals of Nazi Germany hold an extremely violent ideology close to heart. If communication is advanced, it will only be in the control of the state. Technology, which makes the exchange of ideas easier, would be heavily restricted by the Reich. Television and radio are left under the control of the regime. With the German economy dedicated to the military, weapon technology advances much faster than in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, a continent-wide empire uses most of its resources to get an advantage over its enemies. Moving on, in this alternate timeline across the continent, fascism wouldn't be one universal cookie-cut ideology. Each nation
I mean, it never was. There is a difference between a slight difference, granted, between Italian fascism and Nazi fascism. They handled themselves differently.
would adapt fascist beliefs to their national identity. For example, France, Italy, and Spain would boast Catholicism as their national religion. To make fascism more acceptable, it would be associated with already existing ideas. In our timeline, Vichy France created laws
100%.
which were to reverse
totally
the
agree.
effects of the liberal French Revolution. In this alternate scenario, this is the universal theme across Nazi-influenced Europe, as liberal and Enlightenment beliefs are slowly strangled. In France, the government creates a more conservative, authoritarian, and Catholic state. This is different than the Nazis, as Hitler aimed to reinvent German society. The Vichy French simply used the existing conservative elements of French society. Nazi persecution of Catholics in their
I mean, that's kind of why Philippe Pétain was, leader of Vichy France.
eastern territories creates tension between the French and Germans, but faced with the overwhelming threat of force, the Vichy French would voice little public opinion about it and do little action against it. In our timeline, the Nazis held French prisoners of war as practical hostages in labor camps. I believe in this alternate scenario, the same tactics would be used to make sure the populace and governments would not react against German puppet masters. Britain and its empire become the apple in the eye for the Germans. In this alternate timeline, Britain has lost the air battle with the Luftwaffe, and German troops successfully invaded and occupied the island nation. The royal family fled to Canada, but the remaining remnants of the British government are dissolved, replaced with a temporary military government. After the invasion, the occupying Germans treat the British kindly, even going so far to pay for goods and services. The plan was to ease the occupied British into accepting the new government, disband any fear from the stories of
Because it was pretty much... The Germans and the English are they are far closer, at least up until World War I would say. The Germans and English were pretty close to each other, at least compared to, the French. The French were seen as the #1 enemy between, I guess, like both of those, up until the unification of Germany in 1870. And then you could argue that Britain started to see Germany more as a threat instead of looking at France as its historical enemy. It shifted its focus to Germany, and then Germany, of course, after whipping France's butt in 1870, and then up until 1914, was more focused on becoming a challenge to the British superpower.
Poland and Russia. It would be a campaign of kindness. However, after months of kindness, the Germans would secretly implement purges against any political and social groups seen as a threat to the Reich. After occupying Britain for an unspecified amount of time, the Nazis would allow a puppet British government to operate once again. This is also needed to maintain the global empire that stretched across Africa and Asia. Switzerland would have eventually fell. Hitler absolutely despised the Swiss, and would have invaded had the war in Russia not gone so terribly. In this alternate timeline, if Hitler was able to win the war on both fronts, Switzerland is invaded and dissolved. Alternate timeline, I believe the relationship between Nazi Germany and Italy would have gotten far worse. I mentioned in part 1 how Hitler's views on race created tension between him and Benito Mussolini.
100%. The Italians were on the lower southern Mediterranean. Europeans were seen on a lower bar to the Germans.
But this wasn't the only issue between the two. In our timeline, the relationship between Italy and Germany was one of convenience and military protection. The war pact was one that would last only 10 years. That was it. While Italy under Mussolini talked a big game, it simply did not have the resources or industrialization that Germany did to reclaim the Roman Empire. Mussolini even told Hitler that Italy would not be ready for a war at least until 1942, upon which Hitler ignored and invaded Poland, dragging the Italians along with him. Modern Italy was simply not built for fighting. As the conflict raged on, the Italian armies failed to capture North Africa and the Balkans. Relations between the two deteriorated. I predict the relationship going down two possible paths. One, after the defeat of the Russians and no real enemy on the horizon, the Italians simply become too much of a burden and Nazi Germany invades their former ally. Northern Italy is assimilated into the Reich. Southern Italy is devolved into a poor outer state. The Italians are unable to put up much of a resistance against the massive, powerful German war machine. Second, if the relationship remained stable and Germany did not invade, the Nazis would have loomed over Italy for decades. Mussolini's Italian empire is nothing more than a puppet to the Nazi Reich. Italy could hold territory in the Balkans, Mediterranean, and North Africa. However, it is dependent on Germany to maintain control over them. In the immediate aftermath of Nazi victory, thousands die from government neglect, rape, and reprisals for uprisings against the occupiers. Even in states like Greece, Yugoslavia, and other regions not set for depopulation like in Russia, Europe's map is redrawn to include regimes only loyal to the Axis. Greece is renamed to the Hellenic Republic, Yugoslavia is disbanded and split among the independent state of Croatia, Albania, and Italy. In this alternate timeline, Europe is transformed into a new age. In this age, a generation of Europeans are born into a society which encourages violence, lack of individuality, and glory to the state. The thinkers of the Enlightenment and French Revolution are despised, and literature from classical liberal thinkers have been destroyed. As more are born into this world, the easier it becomes to
think about. Is that, if they had succeeded, there would be so many writings that would be lost forever. Well, that's terrifying to think about. I don't like that. Well, you know what? Maybe they would have survived in the United States, because obviously I think in this scenario, Germany never invades the USA. So the Atlantic is, the Western Hemisphere of the world is, I guess, safe from Nazism.
Maintain the myth of Adolf Hitler. Any form of political opinion simply branches off as a form of Nazism, an entire alternate world of political thought based on the progression of the Aryan race. Europeans are taught of the ominous force across the Atlantic, an enemy just like the Jews and communists, the United States. Tune in for part 3, which I guarantee will not take 2 weeks to make. This is Cody of the Alternate History Hub.
That was pretty good. Yeah. Obviously at this point we are completely ignoring the impossibility of the scenario that is Germany winning World War II. However, I think it's still fun to speculate. It's a fun thought process, and I think everything that Cody, Alternate History Hub, mentioned here was solid. I have no disagreements with what he mentioned. It's just a horrifying thought. So yeah, that's where this video is going to end. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.